Great. Well, looks like we're about a minute past the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Still have some few people trickle in. But thanks everyone for joining another UMN Conservation Sciences seminar series. This week, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deondre Smiles. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box or hold them until the end when we do our Q&A in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker. So Dr. Smiles from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria. His research interests include critical Indigenous geographies, human-environment interactions, cultural resource preservation and protection, and science and technology studies. His current research centers around investigating connections between traditional cultural resource management, such as burial grounds, site protection and preservation, and protection of the living environment, including more than human kin, animals, plants, water, with a focus on how new political possibilities can be created for all living things, humans, and more than human alike in an era of climate crisis. Deondre is also the PI of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratory at University of Victoria, which is a research lab that focuses on geographic solutions to questions of Indigenous resurgence and sovereignty. And with that, Dr. Smiles, please take it away.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Jack. It's really good to see you all. I'll get started here with the PowerPoint. I feel like there should be a smoother way to be able to transition between the Zoom kind of landing screen and a PowerPoint. Maybe they'll do that in the future updates. At that point, maybe the pandemic will be over and we won't need to use it anymore, which will probably be how it goes. But until then, we'll just use the tools we got. So here we go. Can you all hear me and see me okay? Can you see the PowerPoint okay?
Yep, all looks great.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so good morning. Mino Gizigeb, Bonjour, Deondre Smiles and Disney. My name is Dr. Deondre Smiles, as introduced. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, but I'd like to welcome you to my talk entitled The Spectral Afterlife of Paul Bunyan, Settler Colonial Greenwashing of Indigenous Environments in Minnesota. Now, you're probably like, that is a heck of a title, and I agree. We'll explain really what all of this means here throughout our 40 to 45 minutes together in this talk, and then a nice 10 to 15 minute Q&A session here at the end. I do want to acknowledge that I am speaking from the Lekwungen-speaking territories here in Victoria, BC. Also recognizing the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanich nations whose relationships with these lands endure to the present day. Recognizing that I'm speaking to folks at the University of Minnesota, which is on occupied Dakota lands there in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the goal of the talk today is to tell you a little bit about a very large figure in my life. Normally when we say that, we talk about our parents, but the fellow here is Paul Bunyan. And so we'll talk a little bit about how the myth of Paul Bunyan serves as both a whitewashing of settler colonial dispossession of Indigenous territories in Minnesota, as well as serves as kind of the ancestor of continuing greenwashing of Minnesota's role in environmentally damaging and disastrous industries that have deep impacts for Indigenous environments. So this is an interactive experience of sorts. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. You also can go ahead and cut me off if you want to unmute yourself, but chat probably works best. If you have a question, just drop it in there. I'm always happy to kind of stop and answer any questions that you might have before going on, because I want to make sure that we are all making this through here together. I hope everybody's feeling good this morning, had a good breakfast, or are looking forward to a good lunch. But let's go ahead and get started. But before I dive into the talk, I always want to introduce myself a little bit further, because I think it's important to understand that I'm not just some guy on the West Coast talking at you this morning about a giant lumberjack and a giant blue ox, but also so you can know a little bit about me and kind of the positionality and where I come from when I approach this work. So a little bit about me. Again, as mentioned, I am an assistant professor in the Department of Geography here at the University of Victoria, which is located in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, out here on the beautiful West Coast, where it's a beautiful fall day here. I know in Minnesota, I was just there last couple of weeks ago, actually, and up in Bemidji, actually, and got treated to some very light flurries up there. So it's a beautiful day here. No snow, although it did snow here a couple of days ago when I was gone. So that's my current position here. I've been here since July of 2021. I am originally from Minneapolis, Agakavikong, as we call it in Anishinaabe. I grew up on the south side, lived at 35th in Chicago for a decent amount of time, and then eventually moved out to the suburbs. I graduated from Osseo Senior High School in 2008. After graduating from Osseo, I was deciding, well, I better go to college. And my mother probably would have been quite disappointed with me if I hadn't. So I went about 50 miles up the road to St. Cloud State University, where I did a bachelor's degree in geography, was there from 2008 to 2013. About halfway through my bachelor's degree, I'm like, you know what I really want to do with my career? I think I want to go off and be a professor. You probably need at least a master's degree to do that, right? Well, I found out I needed a PhD, but at that time, PhDs in geography were still very heavily focused on admitting people with masters. So I'm like, well, I better go get a master's degree. So after taking a gap year and thinking through what I wanted to do, off I went to the University of Minnesota, Duluth, where I did my master's degree in the Master of Liberal Studies program with an emphasis in global Indigenous studies, where I brought together geography and American Indian studies. After my master's degree, I got into the PhD program in geography at The Ohio State University in Columbus, where I went off and did my PhD from 2016 to 2020, got my master's at UMD in 2016. Finished my PhD in the midst of a pandemic. Literally my very last fieldwork trip to Minnesota got cut short because COVID reached the state there in March 2020. And so I went home and subsequently stayed in my apartment for 3 months and finished up my dissertation and defended. After that, I went off and did a postdoc in Indigenous environmental history at Ohio State. During this, I got word about a job in Indigenous geographies at some school called the University of Victoria. And I was like, oh, what's that? That sounds kind of interesting. Well, Victoria looks like it's a bit isolated there on Vancouver Island, but I might as well apply. I applied, interviewed during COVID, did it via Zoom, ended up moving out here in the midst of COVID, and I've been out here ever since. So that's my intellectual genealogy for you. As far as kind of my positionality and how I approach this kind of work, I am an Anishinaabe man. My family comes from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. We are of the Awasisi clan, Bullhead clan. The joke I always tell is in any geography talk, we are contract bound. If you get a PhD in geography, you have to give at least one example of a map in all of your talks, or they come and rip your diploma in front of you. Well, they don't actually do that, but these are my homelands up here, depicted here, the Leech Lake Reservation. Normally when I show this, it's to folks outside of Minnesota. And so I have to explain, like, this is where the Twin Cities are. This is 200 miles northwest of the Twin Cities. But I'm guessing a lot of you are from Minnesota. Some of you, I wonder if there's any Leech Lakers in the audience today. You all definitely know what I'm talking about. So that's where my family comes from. Still have family members up there. Serve on the board of trustees of Leech Lake Tribal College. That's why I was up north a couple of weeks ago. So always enjoy getting to go back home. Always a great time. So there we go. As far as the type of work I do a whole lot of stuff. But the main areas that I focus on are critical Indigenous geographies, human environment interactions, political ecology, Indigenous cultural resource preservation, and science and technology studies. And my current work focuses, as Jack mentioned, about the ways that Indigenous nations are adapting and mitigating climate effects via a lens of cultural resource management, and how we can think about cultural resource management as more than burial sites and artifacts, but also about the living aspects of our environment as well. Finally, as Jack mentioned, I'm the principal investigator of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Lab here at UVic. We are an Indigenous-led lab that focuses on promoting desirable climate and political futures for Indigenous nations through geospatial analysis and tools. Really kind of proud to say we are, if not the first, one of the very first Indigenous geography labs in Western Canada. And so I've started this lab this year, and we are slowly getting ourselves built up. So, all right. Well, that's enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about Paul Bunyan. Now, I'm sure many of you in Minnesota are familiar with Paul Bunyan, right? If you go up to Bemidji, you see the giant statue of Paul Bunyan and Babe that I showed on the first slide. They're still there. I went and checked it a couple of weeks ago. If you ever went to Brainerd and went to Paul Bunyan land, you have that giant talking statue of Paul Bunyan that I've never had the pleasure of experiencing, but I heard it's a really, really creepy experience. If you go up north, anywhere between Brainerd and Cass Lake, if you drive on a Highway 371, it's the Paul Bunyan Expressway. You see signs for places like Paul Bunyan Trail. Paul Bunyan gets his name stuck on tons of stores like gift shops and things of that nature. But for the few of you that may not have heard of Paul Bunyan, let's give a quick overview of exactly who this fella is. Paul Bunyan is a mythical giant lumberjack based on a number of different kind of points of origin. And so one of the kind of origin stories is that during the 19th century in Canada, kind of in the East, there were these stories that were told by French lumberjacks about a man named Paul Bunyan. These were these kind of stories that were told that were kind of like we would view them nowadays as almost like fishing stories. You know, the idea that like, oh, when somebody tells a story about the fish that they caught, how the fish gets longer and bigger every single time, and they fought harder and harder with each retelling of the story. Well, this was a similar thing here, where the story goes that these stories would be told in these camps, these logging camps, and the stories would be, well, Paul Bunyan did X, Y, and Z, and then the next person would have to tell a story that would top that one. And so that's kind of one explanation about where Paul Bunyan came from. But Paul Bunyan, as we understand him today, really had its origins in the early 20th century. There was a company called the Red River Lumber Company that oversaw logging operations in the Northwoods in Minnesota and Canada and other places. And they needed to develop a market to sell their lumber products to, right? Because they weren't just cutting down those trees for nothing. Well, a fellow named William Loghead, which is spelled L-A-U-G head, not L-O-G head. The second spelling would actually be really, really funny if that's really ironic. He was thinking about it, and he got wind of these stories that were being told about Paul Bunyan or Paul Bunyan, and he said, you know, it would be a great idea to kind of retell these stories and put it into an advertising pamphlet for our company, right? And we can kind of say, just like Paul Bunyan has cleared out the North Woods of all these trees and felled dozens or hundreds of trees with one swing of his axe, we can say, well, the Red River Lumber Company is just as effective as cutting down trees, and that's why you should buy our trees to make paper products and other sorts of wood-based products. So in the early 1900s, this pamphlet got published by the Red River Lumber Company that talked about these tall tales of Paul Bunyan. And then from there, Paul Bunyan began to be associated with the logging industry in the turn of the century North America. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask a question. How many of you grew up hearing Paul Bunyan stories? Would you mind putting that in the chat for me? And if you feel especially driven to do so, maybe share kind of one story that you heard about Paul Bunyan. All right, a couple of people did. Somebody went to see the statue in Akeley, which is a picture right here. Whenever my wife and I, when she lived in Duluth and I went to go visit her when I was at OSU, we'd go visit her family in Fargo, and we'd drive across the kind of the northern central part of the state, and we'd pass through Akeley on the way to Fargo, and we'd always pass this, and my wife would be like, that statue's really creepy. And I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. Let's see what other people are saying here. People talking about they visiting the statue in Bemidji, a story about pancakes, wrestling with Babe created in Minnesota's lakes, the giant cradle. Yeah, there's all these stories, right? A couple of the ones that I brought up in the chat here is actually one of the ones that I told when I talked about this here in Canada at a talk was the Bay of Fundy there on the east coast of Canada is renowned for its very powerful tides and heavy wave activity. And the story goes that Paul Bunyan, when he was born and he was being carried over by the storks, there were dozens of storks that were necessary to carry his cradle, right? Because that's how we depicted childbirth back then. And they were carrying him to his parents. And Paul, this little baby got really fussy, right? As babies do, and he started to rock back and forth in kind of his cradle and his bassinet. And the winds that were kicked up off of that bassinet over this body of water roiled up the water and created these powerful waves that have taken centuries to go away, and they haven't quite gone away yet. And that is where the tides of the Bay of Fundy come from. Other stories, right? The pancake story, where they needed to feed an entire camp full of hungry lumberjacks. And how do you do that? Well, you do that via flapjacks, right? Pancakes. And they needed to grease this giant skillet in order to do that. So how do they do that? Well, they strap pieces of butter to Paul's feet, and he skates around the skillet in order to grease it up. Or the other story was that, other version is that in order to feed Paul, they had to have a giant skillet, and they would have to skate around with butter to do that. Or the story about the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota. How did that get formed? Well, via Paul and Babe stomping around, right? In those footprints filling up with water. Or I don't know if how many of you saw the Walt Disney cartoon from the 1950s, where Paul and Babe Roughhousing created the Rocky Mountains and Pikes Peak and carved out all of the plains land of the Great Plains and things of that nature. Let's see what else people are putting there. There is a Disney cartoon, Stephen. Yes, there is. If you go look on YouTube, there's a version of it there. You can also buy it off of Amazon, which I did in preparation for the paper that I'm writing based off of this. The wrestling, people talk about the wrestling story. Yep. So we grew up with these stories, right? When I grew up as a little kid, when we would go to Cass Lake to visit relatives, we'd go over to Bemidji, and there is like this really kind of nice gift shop right across the street there from the statue there in Bemidji. I tried to go in there when I was there a few weeks ago, and it was closed because it was Sunday. But I remember as a little kid, I got this little book, this like kids kind of like cartoon book about Paul Bunyan. And we know Paul Bunyan nowadays is not, based off of these lumberjack stories that were told or from an advertising campaign, but it's kind of, he's taken on this kind of folksy sort of mythological status now, where there's these folk tales about the creation of the physical geographies of Minnesota and North America as a whole that are attributed to Paul Bunyan. And we understand it today is something, Paul Bunyan is something that it's a children's story. It's cute. He's folksy, right? He runs around with a giant blue ox. When I first started teaching about these sorts of things as a master's student at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, and I did so in a writing studies class, this was often what was told to me by the students, because the students kind of pushed back and they said, "You're saying Paul Bunyan is a colonial tool? It's just a kid's story, man. Like, you're taking this way too seriously." Well, unfortunately for them, I think that the seriousness of how I approach Paul Bunyan as well warranted. But before we start talking about why that is, I wanted to find a couple of terms that'll be important to us in this talk. And so that first term is settler colonialism. Well, what is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism is a form of colonization that is built upon the settlement and enduring occupation of land by a colonizing power at the expense of indigenous presence upon the land. All right, that's a mouthful. Let me back up a little bit and kind of break apart that definition a little bit. So when people have historically learned about colonialism, they think about things such as England and France and European nations colonizing Africa and people in pith hats going on, expeditions in jungles and things like that. Those things are associated with what we call traditional or franchise colonialism, which is colonization that is built upon extraction of resources to bring back to the colonial power. Well, settler colonialism has some traits in common with that franchise colonialism, but there are some unique traits to it that make it very distinct. One of these things is that in franchise colonies, oftentimes colonial powers really didn't set down a lot of roots. They did just enough to make sure that they could extract materials and bring it to market. One of the examples I bring up there is that in Africa, you'll notice that a lot of the railroads that were built during European times, they don't connect places in the interior of these countries. They basically ran from the interior to the coast, and that was because they were connected to these mines and plantations and other sites and these railroads made it easier to load goods up onto trains and bring them to the coast, where then they would be loaded on boats to go back to France or England or Belgium or Spain or Portugal or any other of the many colonial powers that had interest in Africa. Well, settler colonialism, the land is the central goal. That people come from a country, they come to stay, they set up cities and towns and villages, they establish farms, and they occupy the land. And there is no end date to colonization, both in franchise and settler colonialism. But kind of the idea is that in franchise colonialism, the colony really had value as long as resources could continue to be extracted from it. In settler colonialism, there is kind of not this mythological end date where people will be like, well, we've done all we can do. Let's go back to the UK. Let's go back to France. No, according to the late scholar Patrick Wolfe, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. And what I mean by this is that there are these legal structures, political structures, cultural structures that are brought up to justify colonization and dispossession of the land. A scholar named Cy Englert's, talking in the context of Palestine, mentioned that, well, settler colonialism is also focused on exploitation of land to a certain degree, right? Where you're building farms, you're trying to extract capital from the land, but that land is still the central logic. In settler colonialism, it eliminates to replace. And so it basically bulldozes indigenous presence, whether that's through brutal genocide of indigenous peoples or the obscuring of indigenous relationships with land, to build over it with kind of these settler histories and settler relationships. And it relies on a myth of what we call terra nullius to proceed. That's probably a new term to some folks, right? Terra nullius. And so let's tease this apart a little bit. So terra nullius is a term that means nobody's land in Latin. And this is at the heart of settler colonial mythology. And so you may not be familiar with the term terra nullius, but if you've read historical accounts of colonization in the United States, or even kind of current day understandings of indigenous presence, you might hear things like, well, the land was empty, right? The United States and North American continent was a wilderness. When people back then and contemporaneously bring up that, well, there are indigenous peoples here, there were indigenous peoples here, the common argument often centered around, well, the indigenous peoples or these natives are bad at using the land productively, right? Like, look at them. They're not farming, they're not mining, they're not doing all of these economically beneficial activities that we're doing in Europe. They're clearly really bad at using the land, almost to the point where it's as good as unused anyways, right? Because they're not using it productively. One example that was given by a geographer out here in BC, Cole Harris, gives an account of a British officer, because it's back in the 19th century, talking to First Nations groups, essentially telling them, before we came along, you didn't know how to farm, you didn't know how to mine. We taught you how to do all these things. You ought to be grateful that we've shown you civilization and shown you how to be civilized human beings. Actual accounts by a British governmental official. Right. So the picture here on the right-hand side is a portrait called Manifest Destiny, which is a perfect example of terra nullius, where you see on the right-hand side, it's probably a little bit tough to see on your screens, but you see kind of here in the east, kind of this civilization, right? A port city, a bustling city, railroads, electrical, telegraph wires, farmers, stagecoaches, settlers and pioneers moving to the west. And you see kind of the shading here is also really important, because it's depicted kind of in this light, kind of almost angelic sort of kind of framework. And you see here Manifest Destiny herself, this actual angelic Christian kind of figure, kind of demonstrating the benefits of Western civilization. The book that she has here is actually a school book showing kind of education and kind of this Western Enlightenment that was in vogue in the 19th century when this was created. And you take a look on the left-hand side here, you see a couple of things. You see indigenous peoples moving to the left out of the frame of the picture, and that was meant to depict them being pushed all the way to the Pacific coast. And you kind of see them, they're kind of like have their fists kind of raised, kind of angry, kind of being hostile. And you see wild animals being pushed away as well. Kind of this idea that the wilderness was something that needed to be tamed and was a God-given right of American settlers to do so. Manifest Destiny. And so terra nullius, it's actually a legal term in the Australian context. There's been a number of court cases that have been litigated over this, but there are similar concepts in America and in Canada as well. Manifest destiny, kind of this idea of this God-ordained rights to colonize the continent. All right. So how has this looked with the environment? Well, as settlers moved west and created these large farms and plantations and extracted natural resources and overhunted animals, this led to widespread changes to geographies and environments. One of the most well-known examples is the overhunting of bison to the point of extinction and the creation of farms that were based on extracting maximum capital right away. Back then in the 19th century, there really wasn't a firm understanding of soil science, and so people would just plant the same crops over and over. There was no idea of crop rotation as indigenous peoples had practiced, and so that led to things like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. But these widespread changes endure to the present day as well. So there are modern day contestations over extractive industries such as mining, pipeline development, probably one of the most pressing issues in indigenous sovereignty, and kind of contestations between the indigenous communities in Canada and the United States and the United States and Canadian governments today. No matter the manner through which indigenous landscapes were placed at peril, they are done so via all of these different things, right? And so one of the kind of examples that I like to point out that Nick Estes wrote about in his book, Our History is Our Future, talks about the Pick-Sloan Act and the damming of the Missouri River, which led to the flooding of millions of acres of indigenous territories in the name of irrigation and recreation by settlers. As well as examples like abandoned uranium mines in the Navajo reservation on the Navajo Nation, where these mines created or were used to mine uranium that was used in the United States as nuclear programs, both military and civilian. And they left these mines after the uranium deposits gave out, leading to harmful health issues on the Navajo Nation, simply through a variety of ways, not only just through the fact that you're leaving open uranium mines out there in the landscape, but also through infiltration of radioactive material into the water and the generations of Navajo workers who worked in these mines without any kind of adequate protection. So I could talk on and on about this. I teach a course about this, but the settler colonialism has had disastrous effects on the environment. Another thing that settler colonialism accomplishes, as I mentioned, is the erasure of indigenous land and histories. And so in the context of Minnesota, there were a series of land cession treaties in Minnesota in the 19th century. So these land cession treaties were treaties that were signed purportedly on a government-to-government basis between the United States and indigenous peoples, where indigenous peoples would agree to vacate and open up large swaths of territory for settlement by American settlers in exchange for land on reservations and for continued treaty rights in these ceded territories, such as hunting and fishing and gathering rights, for example. My people, the Leech Lake Band, we are in 1855 territory. I have very familiar, having lived in Duluth, with the 1854 ceded territory and the 1854 Treaty Authority. So these treaties were signed, and as we probably all know, they were never signed in good faith by the American government. The idea was that, well, these natives are going to disappear eventually anyway, so we'll give them what they want. We'll say anything to get access to the land, because hopefully they won't be around long enough to enjoy these treaty rights. And so these land cession treaties were one way that indigenous land passed out of the hands of indigenous peoples into settlers. Of course, we have the Dawes Act as well, an allotment. In some cases, this loss of land was far more violent, right? And so we are familiar with the 1862 US-Dakota War. At the conclusion of that war, the Dakota people were banished from Minnesota. As a matter of fact, there is still a law on the books in Minnesota state law where Dakota peoples are not allowed back into the state, which of course, it's too late for that now, not only because Dakota people are still here not only through sovereign territories, but also through returning to the state, but that law is still in the books. There is this broad, widespread erasure and ignorance of true Indigenous histories and relationships with the land, right? Where people kind of grow up now with this kind of story of Minnesota being settled and developed by Scandinavian and German settlers, instead of understanding it as being Indigenous lands and understanding these kind of long-standing histories. One of the things I think I remember asking my students in Duluth, can you tell me which treaty territory we stand on? And not a single one of them could answer, right? They knew the origin of the name Duluth, which comes from Sir Duluth, who was an explorer who explored the western tip of Lake Superior in the 1600s, but they didn't understand those Indigenous histories. Another thing, since want to keep this talk kind of ecologically focused, is another form of erasure, right? Is these settler discoveries of ecological knowledge that has been held by Indigenous peoples for generations. And so every so often, there will be this new article that will come out in a geography journal or an ecology journal, or like in a conservation journal, where they'll be like, we've just discovered this new form of environmental knowledge. And look at this, this is absolutely amazing. Give us all the grant money, give us the citations, give us all these things. And then without fail, before too long, somebody will come forward and they'll say, you know, that local nation close to you, they've known that for generations, right? Are you sure you're the first person who's come up with that? And then people are like, well, they don't have a PhD, so that's okay. Like we are the ones that are entitled to kind of claim this sort of knowledge. And so all of these things are really part and parcel of this erasure of Indigenous land and histories. And so I want to show a quick map here, this really cool animated map. I did not make this map. A person at Louisiana State made this, but it shows kind of the gradual erosion of Indigenous lands. So I'll go through a few cycles of this here. It doesn't show the land claims on the East Coast, which is the only kind of quibble I have with this map, but it's a really good animation of kind of showing this gradual movement of American settlements through Indigenous territories. All right. So now that we've gotten kind of those historical backgrounds out of the way, let's go back to our good friend, Paul Bunyan. And so how does Paul Bunyan tie into all of this? How is Paul Bunyan part of settler colonial erasure of land and histories and greenwashing and all these things that you talk about in your title slide, Deondre? You're probably asking, well, let's dive in and let's chat about exactly how these things are connected. And so my introduction to kind of the more problematic elements of the Paul Bunyan story came via a zine and a video that were created in 2014 by a fellow by the name of Nick Nurburn, and he called it In the Shadow of Paul Bunyan. And Nick Nurburn is a guy from Bemidji. He grew up in Bemidji, and he starts out this zine, or kind of this homemade kind of like magazine publication, in the video by talking about his childhood, how he grew up in Bemidji and how he would go past the giant statue of Paul and Babe every day, and how Bemidji has had this long history of embrace of Paul Bunyan. Their mascots are the Lumberjacks. Their town celebration, at least back when Nick Nurburn was growing up, was something like Paul Bunyan Days. He found archival footage of like these huge parades and things that were done in Paul Bunyan's honor. And he talks about growing up with this and kind of understanding this story, similarly as how I explained it earlier, where he thinks of this as a very folksy, very just kind of like this child story that's supposed to be kind of cute and something that's like, oh, that's kind of nice. That's a nice way of thinking about the development of Minnesota. But then as he grows up and he begins to dig deeper into the history of Minnesota, he starts to have a bit of doubt about Paul Bunyan. I highly recommend reading the zine and watching the video. You can, if you Google In the Shadow of Paul Bunyan, you'll get the Vimeo page of the documentary of the video. I think the zine might be available on Google, but if not, I can pass it on to Jack, who can circulate it among people who are interested. But Nick Nurburn reads about the history of the 1862 war and the 38+2 Dakota who were executed. He reads about things like the Sandy Lake tragedy and the move of Indigenous peoples in Minnesota onto reservations and allotment. And he starts to think, well, might Paul Bunyan be a form of whitewashing? And what he means is, might this be a way for people in Minnesota to feel comfortable with the history of their state? Might it be a way for them to overwrite this history of theft of Indigenous land and brutal subjugation of Indigenous communities, and instead framing this history of Minnesota as, something that's benign, banal? That's just, there's nothing controversial about it. What do you mean? Minnesota just kind of sprang up into being out of nowhere, right? Or if we want to get really folksy about it, well, Paul Bunyan created Minnesota. He was kind of the forefather of the state. What are you talking about? Indigenous disposition? Well, there's no native peoples here, right? So I've been thinking about this ever since I first taught this in 2015 about kind of this whitewashing, and this was via the kind of the mentorship of a fellow named David Beard, who was my program director and mentor up at UMD during my master's project. And I've been thinking about Paul Bunyan in a whole new way ever since. And I know a number of scholars, including really most notably recently, a friend of mine, Casey Keeler at the University of Wisconsin, who's an Indigenous scholar, has just written a piece about this. A number of people have written about kind of these memorializations of Paul Bunyan in places from Minnesota to California. People are thinking about Paul Bunyan in kind of whole new ways. The way that I'm thinking about Paul Bunyan is in the form of greenwashing. So let's define greenwashing. Greenwashing is an attempt to reframe or remarket or rebrand something as being environmentally friendly when it is not, right? And it's really popular to be eco-friendly nowadays as we face climate change right in the face, where companies that are polluting and doing economically and environmentally extractive activities, now they can't remarket themselves fast enough to be eco-friendly, right? Look at what we're doing to try to protect the environment, right? We might be digging holes in the ground to mine things, but hey, we're donating money to plant trees elsewhere, right? Or at least we're using electric vehicles to do our extractive activities or what have you, right? We all kind of know that greenwashing is not a good term, that basically it's trying to put a ecologically friendly face on something that is anything but. And the question that I've been asking myself is, well, given the history of conservation and environmental movements as being kind of tied in with white supremacy, and I say that because if we understand the history of things like the Sierra Club and John Muir and kind of the modern conservation movement in the early 1900s, it comes from this kind of point of view that, well, the environment is being damaged and we need to protect it and we need to return it to this mythologized, unspoiled, untouched existence. And that early history, of course, came from the settler colonial framework of like, well, the indigenous peoples don't even figure into this, right? Well, they're not even going to be here. And, if we don't have to think about the fact that we stole this land to begin with, then we don't have to deal with kind of the messy situation of like, well, do we involve indigenous peoples in this conservation? Fortunately, conservation has moved forward from that, but there is that history. And so I said, well, could indigenous land theft also be greenwashed in a way? All right, so Minnesota, whenever I think about it, I think about being on the shores of Gitchigani or Lake Superior, of standing over by Leech Lake at Whipple Beach, looking out, by going down to Minnehaha Falls and hiking down by the Mississippi River, going to Bede-Makaska. I always think about outdoorsy things when I think about home, and maybe that's because I'm really homesick for kind of the environments there. But when Minnesota markets itself abroad, right? And when I mean abroad, I mean internationally, but also within the United States, we tend to, and I say we because I'm a Minnesotan as well, we tend to focus on the environmental traits and the desirable kind of outdoorsy elements of Minnesota, right? So we think about going up north to the cabin and going out on the dock on the lake and spending time with the family on a beautiful July or August weekend, right? There in the late summer, which is pictured here. Going out on a dock and canoeing, not your thing. Maybe you're a bit more of a winter sports enthusiast. Well, we've got surfing on Lake Superior, something that also the state is known for, especially out here in BC, where we have some awesome surfing as well. Maybe you're not exactly a big fan of getting into the water when it's freezing cold, but you like being out on the water. Well, what about the Boundary Waters, right? One of the most well-known areas of Minnesota, this wilderness that is set aside for people to go out and enjoy. This is how Minnesota tries to market itself from an official standpoint, but also kind of broadly as a state, as as a socio-cultural entity, right? That Minnesota is a state that is environmentally friendly, that is looking forward towards a more ecologically just future. And it's a place that if you really want to get outside and get away from it all, this is a place to do it, right? Well, there's also another activity that's going on in Minnesota called environmental degradation. So Minnesota has a long history of logging, right? Beginning in the 19th century when Minnesota began to be settled, large swaths of the North Woods have been cut down. We're all familiar with the long history of iron mining in Minnesota since the 19th century. First hematite mining, which was the very, very rich iron ores, and then when that gave out in the 1940s. With the development of the University of Minnesota, taconite, which allowed more small scale mining. And I mean that kind of tongue in cheek, because if you've ever gone to Hibbing and been to the open pit mine there, that is a humongous place. Still an active mine. And they've been mining that and other places since after World War II for taconite. One of the more kind of contemporary kind of issues up in the Iron Range centers around copper sulfide mining in the boundary waters. PolyMet's put a lot of money into trying to market it as something that can serve as an economic benefit to the range. But of course, that comes with water pollution risks. Pipeline construction and reconstruction throughout the state. We all know about Line 3, right? One of the most annoying things for me, and this is kind of my personal editorial view, is driving through up near Duluth when I lived up there and seeing signs saying Minnesotans for Line 3. As somebody who has family members buried in the cemetery up there on Leech Lake, that's about 400 yards away from Line 3's route, I tend to take a bit of a different view about Line 3. And I'll give an example of why exactly that is and why places like Leech Lake have been opposed to this. All of these forms of environmental degradation in Minnesota have had very, very harmful consequences. And so I'm going to show a series of maps here. And so this is a map from the U.S. Forest Service that shows the extent of old growth forest. They depict it as they call it virgin forest. Here I cross that out because virgin forest is a form of indigenous erasure where it basically says, well, this was untouched, not thinking about the ways that indigenous peoples have had relationships with forest landscapes. This is what it looked like in 1850, right? And so you see in Minnesota in particular, like you start to see kind of here in kind of the more prairie regions of the state, there are some trees, more deciduous trees, and then the evergreen forests of the North Woods in the northeastern section of the state here are still relatively untouched. Out here on the West Coast and out in the Great Basin region, we haven't had any logging yet, right? Well, let's fast forward to 1926, 76 years later. This is kind of at the end of kind of the great kind of golden era of logging in the United States. You see there is a lot of logging that has been going on in places such as the North Woods of Minnesota have essentially been logged over, going from 1850 there to 26. So back then when people would cut trees down, right? Oftentimes they would leave waste material there. They were just after the logs, the trunks of the tree. And they would leave whatever they didn't need there. And they were like, oh, whatever, like it's nature. We don't need to worry about it anymore. Well, there's a reason why nowadays park rangers say, make sure you clean up your fires when you are done and put them out completely and don't leave any kind of kindling or anything nearby, right? Because if you leave fuel for fires out in the conditions are right for a fire and that material is sitting there, it'll combust and it'll start fires, and that's how we get wildfires. Well, in 1894 in Hinckley, Minnesota, this was a time when there was a lot of logging there in Pine County, and there's a lot of waste material that was left over. Fire got started one day, and it was disastrous. Probably many of you know the story of the Hinckley fire, where eyewitness accounts talk about fireballs miles high from the fire that was being fueled by this material. One of the stories that I always tell folks is that a train was trying to get away from the fire with tons of refugees. They were going full speed ahead on the train. They managed to get to, I think, Moose Lake or Barnum. One of these towns north of Hinckley, and they think they escaped the fire. They get out, they take a look, the caboose is on fire because the fire was spreading that quickly. Killed many, many people, burned entire towns off of the map, destroyed the landscape. We had a similar fire near Duluth and Cloquet in 1918. this aftermath of kind of this widespread logging. As far as mining goes, this is a 1970s view of Silver Bay, Minnesota, which was a town that was developed to ship taconite from Babbitt and other towns there on the East Range. That was shipped via railroad to Silver Bay, where it was loaded on boats. As far as the tailing or kind of the waste material from the taconite, initially they thought, well, we'll just leave it right next to the lake, right? It's not going to harm anything. Until the early 1970s, when asbestos fibers began showing up in Duluth's drinking water. And then there was a large lawsuit that led to Reserve Mining Company having to pay money to build taconite tailing ponds back over in this area, kind of north and west of the town, to store that taconite tailing material where it remains to this day. The Prairie Island Nuclear Power Plant facility, which is located near the Prairie Island community. Couple of problematic elements. It's located in a floodplain in the Mississippi River. These casts where the nuclear waste is stored are relatively unprotected. Well, they say, well, these casts could protect, we'll probably keep it from the nuclear material from getting out, but nobody really knows for sure because we haven't had a 500-year flood in the Mississippi River in some time. And there's kind of questions by the Prairie Island community about, well, if there is a flood, what happens to the power plant? What happens if there's a meltdown? What happens if these casts get picked up and put out into the river and somehow crack open? Not to mention the fact that the Prairie Island community has some serious misgivings about a nuclear power plant being located several hundred yards away from buildings on the reservation. And finally, the example about Line 3. So Minnesota is host to the largest inland oil spill in American history. In early 1991, Line 3 sprung a leak over the Prairie River, which is located near Grand Rapids and is a tributary of the Mississippi. We were really fortunate that the river was frozen over and the oil kind of spilled out on this ice, as lucky as I guess you can get with a pipeline leak, because if it had been open water, it would have contaminated the water source for millions of Minnesotans and Americans. All right. So what does this all mean? To recap this, right? Minnesota portrays itself as a very environmentally conscious, outdoors focused state. We build that into tourism materials. We build that into the way that we market the state. When we do think about Indigenous presence, it's kind of like this whitewashed, very sanitized kind of view of like, oh, well, there's 11 tribal nations in Minnesota and we have these great relationships. We have an Anishinaabe lieutenant governor who takes photo ops of people and her ribbon skirt. Look how Indigenous she is. Look at what all the good work Minnesota is doing with Indigenous peoples, right? This all overwrites this long-standing history of resource exploitation and environmental degradation, as well as their connection to Indigenous land. That's when we market Lake Superior. We don't say, oh yeah, back in the 1970s, there was asbestos fibers that found its way into the drinking water of a city of 100,000 people, right? Oh, when you go up to Grand Rapids, yeah, did you ever see the spot right here where a pipeline sprung a leak and spilled millions of gallons of oil onto a frozen river? Hey, you should, when you go down to Red Wing and go down along the bluffs along Lake Pepin, make sure you stop by the Prairie Island Nuclear Power Plant, which has a not perfect safety record and is also right next to an Indigenous community, right? And then, of course, there's not a lot of talk about, well, how is it that Indigenous peoples ended up on reservations in Minnesota in the first place? And what does this all mean for our idea of Paul Bunyan? Well, I say that Paul Bunyan is kind of this, we view this kind of folksy figure as kind of a stand-in for the history of Minnesota, right? When you read about accounts of Paul Bunyan, a lot of times there are no Indigenous peoples, there's no Native people there. And it kind of coincides with this kind of idea that, well, Minnesota just kind of got developed, that there were Native people here, but they're gone now, and now we don't really need to worry about them anymore. All right, I have just a couple of slides here left. So there's another Paul Bunyan story, and this one is my particular favorite. So the story goes that Nana Buju, kind of an Ojibwe spiritual figure, got really pissed off at Paul Bunyan that he was going around stomping holes in the earth and cutting down trees and kind of reshaping kind of these landscapes. And Nana Buju said, I want you to cut it out. And Paul Bunyan did not cut it out. And Nana Buju got pretty pissed at Paul Bunyan and he beat the shit out of him with a giant fish and knocked him out. Now, One telling of the story says, as penance, Nana Buju was forced to stand across from Paul Bunyan in Bemidji and kind of stand in deference to him. If you actually go to that Paul Bunyan statue and you kind of turn and look to the west, on top of kind of that gift shop, you'll notice kind of a giant statue of a native man kind of standing and giving like kind of like a salute of some kind. They say that's Nana Buju kind of paying penance for what he did to Paul Bunyan. I like to tell a different story where I say, maybe it's time that we slap Paul Bunyan in settler colonial greenwashing across the face again with a giant fish. And what do I mean by that? I mean bringing in traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous ecological knowledge, and furthering the resurgence of these things in indigenous cultural and political and environmental sovereignty. Well, indigenous nations are doing this now, right? There's these ongoing efforts and initiatives by indigenous nations, both on both sides of this colonial boundary between the US and Canada, to contend with anthropogenic environmental changes and often based in cultural frameworks. The book, I was just talking about this with a friend of mine from UW Platteville this morning, a tribal climate adaptation menu. One of my favorite books. This is a really good example of this, alongside the work that folks like the 1854 Treaty Authority and scholars like Michael Dockery at the U of M are doing, working with nations to really help further their environmental futures. And these things center indigenous worldviews and ongoing cultural practices, right? So I think about Monoman, one of my absolute favorite things. Let's see if I'll give you proof that I was at Leech Lake. I brought some wild rice back for my colleagues, and wild rice is a very ecologically sensitive plant. Monoman, very sensitive, and so doing work to make sure that it can grow and thrive in the face of climate change and warming water temperatures in Monoman growing areas in the northern parts of the state. Another example that I like to give here is the Grand Portage Band up there on the far tip of the state had a bit of a dilemma about a decade or two ago. And moose, which they relied on both for cultural activities of hunting, but also as a food source, were beginning to move north into Canada, and they were not as frequent around Grand Portage as they used to be. And folks at Grand Portage kind of were talking amongst each other and said, what do we do? The moose are starting to go away. Pretty soon we're not going to have any moose around here at all. And somebody had the bright idea. They said, well, there's another giant hooved animal that might thrive up here. And they brought a herd of bison onto the reservation. And there is a bison ranch to this day that they maintain. And so they're able to practice cultural activities, maybe with a different animal than they had done before. But just as this is an example of just the sheer ingenuity and resilience of indigenous nations, right? And so doing things like this, we slap the idea of this settler colonial greenwashing in the face over and over and over again, and really create these desirable futures for indigenous peoples in our environments going into the future, right? With climate change, the common refrain among settlers is like, the world's going to be ending, right? What are we going to do? We're going to get flooded out of our homes. Everything's going to burn down. Save us, Jeff Bezos. Save us, Elon Musk, as we kind of see Elon Musk can't even save Twitter right now. But indigenous nations kind of say, relax, chill. We've got this. We've survived apocalypses over and over and over again. And if you listen to us, maybe we can teach you a thing or two about how to survive this one as well. So I know we just have a few minutes left, and fortunately we're on the second to last slide here. I want to leave you with a quote from a scholar named Leroy Littlebear. When I was at the Ecological Society of America annual meeting in Montreal this year, he gave a talk about kind of indigenous environments and how we think about them. And I thought this was really appropriate given kind of the history of Paul Bunyan creating the 10,000 lakes by stomping around. Leroy Littlebear would probably give us a little bit of a different idea about how to be in relation with the earth. He says, so Homo sapiens, especially the youngest of you, maybe you should wear moccasins so that you don't make such big imprints on the land, so our ecological dreams can become a reality. That is, if you want us to be around in 10,000 years. So with that, I say miigwech gigawabamin. Thank you all so very, very much for your time and your attention this morning. Here is my contact information, my email address, my website, my Twitter, which I'll be on Twitter until the very bitter end. If the predictions come true, maybe Twitter might fall apart. So maybe I'll have to switch that over at some point to my Mastodon information. But this is how you can get connected with me. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Well, thanks again, Dr. Smiles. That was fantastic. And I think we could all probably relate a little bit to your thoughts on Twitter and everything else that's going on. If we anybody does have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, unmute yourself and ask it directly. It looks like we've got maybe 4 minutes, because I know, Deondre, I think you said you have to go right on the hour to hop over to another meeting.
I actually do not. That meeting was my grad students, and we had to reschedule that. So I am willing to stick around.
Okay.
Well, if there are questions.
Fantastic. Well, I guess while people, looks like we got a question there from Erica. Can you see the chat, or would you like me to maybe help facilitate that?
I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. I have thoughts too, but you can go ahead and facilitate, Jack. That'd be good.
So let's see. Erica asks, do you have thoughts on proposed copper and nickel mining of the Duluth-Gabbro complex? We are supposed to do presentations on this in my mineralogy class.
Yeah, so is this the same? Is this polymet, or is this something different? Is this kind of up in like the northeastern, kind of like near Ely, the Boundary Waters? Or is this in a bit of a different location? Because a lot of the thinking I've done has been around polymets, which I suppose is probably all the same. My thoughts about it is that well, I mean, I'm opposed to it, but it's more than an environmental sort of concern. So I lived on the range for a bit, and I have friends who have done a lot of work on the range, and people who like live on the range and are very mindful of these sorts of things. And I feel like there's often been this desire of folks on the range to try to get back to kind of these this era of prosperity, right? Back to like the early 20th century, when every town on the range had like this $1 million school, and there was like a vibrant community scene, and that everyone had work, which has been not the case on the range since the 1950s and the 1960s, right? That mining has become a very deeply seasonal activity, that there's not enough jobs for everyone, that a lot of the jobs that are available for mining now are these very high-tech jobs where people are brought in from outside of the range and outside of the United States. And so there's the ecological kind of aspect where this mining is very environmentally damaging, right? It can lead to deep infiltration of pollutants into aquifers and water sources there in the Boundary Waters. But also, I think that this idea that polymet is pushing, that it's like this cure-all to the economic woes of the range is not true, right? Because if you take a look at the economic impacts and kind of the breakdown of the jobs that are available, there is only a handful of jobs that really would come out of this that would be available to rangers to be able to take. And when you're dealing with a large workforce that is seasonal, right, we'd be talking hundreds of thousands of jobs, not the dozens to maybe 100 that might come out of the polymet mining. And so that's kind of my thoughts. I'm very open about my kind of positionality, as well as saying like, yeah, I think it's really ecologically bad. I think it continues to erase indigenous kind of input in the region, especially on the range, where people are like, well, there's no reservations near here. Well, Boys Fort has a reservation has their Lake Vermilion reservation up in Tower, right? And has very vocally been against this, as well as other nations in the 1854 ceded territories. And so it's one of these things where I think it's being sold as something that it really can't deliver on, right? That it's going to be this economic benefit that's environmentally neutral. It's going to be neither of those things.
And then it looks like we've got another question here from Colby. What kind of outreach would you like to see graduate students and our PIs doing with Indigenous communities? Going to schools and talking about our work with kids, maybe meeting with community leaders to discuss what types of research questions they would like answered. Any other ideas?
That's a great question, Colby. I'd say all of the above, right? Knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange is really, really deeply important, right? And so if you have the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities, going and sharing about the work that you're doing, allowing community members to ask questions and have active input into the work that's being done is really vitally important. Kind of another, I guess, the sixth area that I didn't list on my slide about my research interests is Indigenous research ethics. And I strongly believe that community engagement and community consultation is really deeply important to doing this kind of work. And it helps to break down this artificial wall that surrounds us here in academia, kind of the ivory tower. Meeting with community leaders and discussing which types of research questions they would like answered. I think that's huge as well, right? Our lab has a policy that we don't go where we're not invited, and that we center the community's needs in the work that we do. And so we will never go into a community and say, here we are, here's the work that we want to do. We're going to do it. See you later. See you in 8 months when you report, right? It's a long process of sitting down and saying, here's the privileges and here's the tools that we have here in the academy. How can we leverage that to help you answer the questions that are deeply important to you? How do we do work that you want to have done towards outcomes that you've defined for yourself, right? For the GIF lab, a successful project for me is not just one where we get $1 million grant out of it and a ton of articles, but also something that, like, have we empowered the community to be able to pick up the work that we're doing and take it and carry the baton and do it themselves, right? Where eventually they won't need us because they're empowered and they have the capacity to carry on that kind of work. So I think all the things you're listing are great, right? And I think it really boils down to communication, conversation, right? Just talking with folks. I always kind of say, and kind of jokingly, but also in a serious way, right? Native, you know that you're all right with Native people when we talk to you. It's when we don't talk to you when you know you're in trouble, right? And so I'm like, even if they're asking kind of tough questions, even if they're like, well, who are you? What are you about? Why do you want to work with us? This is always a good thing because it gives you a chance to have that open line of conversation. And I'm like, if they ever stop talking to you, that's when you need to do some hardcore apologizing or perhaps think about leaving, like not doing that work, right? Because it really just comes down to talking with folks and being open to what they're saying, listening.
Hi, Jack. Hi, Deondre. Thanks for a great talk. I have a question that, you did a really nice job. I really appreciated the context with which you made your points. And that matters, I think, to intent versus impact. And particularly like what like a wildlife ecologist or a fisheries biologist or a conservation biologist might do in their, practice of science. They might have this intent of adding incrementally or providing some applied aspect that is helpful, without the intent of erasing or assuming novelty or erasing knowledge. So how do you assess that, intent versus impact when you're looking at, what we do?
I need to unmute myself. I think that's a great question as well, right? And I think that it's pretty rare. I find for folks that are doing this kind of work to go out there, and nobody usually intends to go out there and do harm, right? The folks that do, we can tell who they are like right away, and they usually get shunned and things like that. But I think intent is gets you half of the way there, right? And so like if we're intending on doing good work, if that's our intention, right? I think how to make sure that those intentions are staying kind of in a good place and how that intention is influencing the impact is to kind of do these kinds of check-ins with yourself, right? Kind of think like, what is the state of my communication and consultation with these communities? How am I bringing in Indigenous perspectives into my work in a non-extractive way that centers these kind of perspectives and gives them a platform, right? And really, I think that really can do a lot to really help these kinds of things, because it helps to at least reground ourselves and recenter ourselves and kind of think, are our impacts matching up with our intentions? And if they're not, how do we reframe our actions so that these things are in better synchronicity with each other?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. It looks like we've got maybe one more question here from Colleen in the chat. I'm curious what ideas are suggested in the book about Indigenous ideas about responding to climate change. If you have time to mention maybe one or two.
Oh, I do. And I feel like I'm looking at my bookshelf right now. With my luck, I didn't, let me just make sure I might have it here. But with my luck, I probably don't. I tend to, my books are like in 3 different spots between here, my apartment in Victoria and Seattle, where my wife lives. And so one of the things one of the big things that they talk about is actually cultural revitalization. And so they talk about these kind of scientific, ecological ways of adapting to climate change, but they also say, well, how do we think about our cultural activities? So I'll give Grand Portage again as an example, right? Where they had a conversation where they said, well, moose are culturally important to us, but what do we do if the moose disappear? Does that mean that we have to abandon that part of our culture? And the folks that wrote the climate adaptation menu would say, no, this just means that you need to think about ways that culture can be shifted to take into account kind of these new ecological realities, but also it gives us a good opportunity to revitalize these cultural practices, right? Saying that because this is changing, we have to re-embrace these sorts of things in order to put them into practice so that we can shift them and provide an example for future generations, right? And so they talk about things such as, cultural activities like fishing and gathering, but they also talk about like language revitalization and historical, awareness and things like that. Because if you are, and I'm giving a talk about this tomorrow, actually, at a conference in Sudbury, Ontario, about language and geography and kind of it relation with land, right? That if you understand kind of the broader facets of your culture, then you are empowered to be able to understand how to best adapt and change things in order to meet the changing environment around you. And so that was something that was really powerful to me in that climate adaptation menu, is about kind of the role of cultural revitalization, right? That it's not just a physical environmental thing, but it's a holistic kind of understanding as well about what about the intangible aspects that we need to tend to.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at about 107, so maybe we'll stop there. But again, I think everybody has your contact information on all the various platforms so people can reach out. But yeah, thanks again, Deondre. That was a really fantastic talk and super important.
Thank you all for having me so much. Hopefully I'll lobby to do this again. Hopefully maybe in Minneapolis next time, or St. Paul, I guess.
Yes, yeah, that'd be fantastic. All right. Yeah, have a good rest of your weekend, everybody. And Deondre, good luck with your talk at the conference tomorrow.
Thank you all so much. Miigwech, everybody. Have a good day.